This is Jill Kelly, and I'm here with Daniel Sledge on July 29th. It's about 10:15 a.m., and we are in Alexandria, Virginia, recording an interview for the Global Oral History of PEPFAR project. And so to begin with, would you introduce yourself?
My name is Jendayi Frazer. I am a former Bush administration official. I served in the White House, at the State Department, and overseas in South Africa.
Okay. And will you briefly tell us about yourself and your background, when and where you were born? Tell us a little bit about your family, your education.
Well, I was born in Chicago, Illinois, November 25th, 1961. It was by accident. My mother is from Arkansas. My father is from the Virgin Islands. My father was in the military, so we moved quite frequently, but I also spent quite a lot of time in Nebraska. Mainly when he was during Vietnam, we would be in Nebraska where my grandparents were, and otherwise in Texas and in the Midwest.
Okay, all right. That's an exciting. So you spent most of your kind of formative education years in Nebraska. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, elementary school was Nebraska.
Okay.
Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri was junior high. Frankfurt, Germany was high school.
Okay, all right.
And then college was at Stanford.
Okay, and you want to tell us about what you studied and how it led you into this career?
I studied political science when I was at Stanford, and African American studies. I was interested in Africa from high school days, and did a lot in literature, reading books from African authors. And so that really got me quite interested in the culture and the history of the continent. And then in college, I studied political science. I was very much interested in politics. My father and I argued quite often about politics and global affairs. And so that allowed me to have this more global interest. And so in college, I did the BA in political science and African American studies. Then I did a master's degree in international policy studies, and then in international development education, and then the PhD in political science.
Okay. Do I remember reading, did you study abroad in college?
I did. I did a broad study in Kenya,
Okay.
Nairobi, Kenya, at the University of Nairobi. And that was 1981-82, basically my sophomore year, and I came back in my sophomore year. And at that time, they had an attempted coup d'etat.
I was going to say, that's an exciting time in Kenyan history.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And so that then got me interested in political military affairs.
Okay.
So then I went back to Stanford and started focusing in that area.
Okay. As you came into this work, quite knowledgeable about the African continent and its past. Before you started working in government, what was your sense of the HIV and AIDS pandemic?
Well, I became familiar with it when I was in Kenya in the 1980s. And then when I went back to do my PhD research in the 1990s, that's really where I started seeing it. It was called the skinny disease at that time, because people lost so much weight. And so I was quite aware that there was a problem happening, but didn't really understand the magnitude of it until I was in government.
Okay, so you finish your PhD and start an academic career, and then you have a fellowship at the Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs. Can you tell us about what led you to pursue that opportunity, and also for someone who's listening who might not know about the fellowship, can you tell them what
Sure.
it's for?
Well, you know, I had a very good mentor in Condoleezza Rice, and when I was doing my PhD research, Condoleezza Rice went to government and served in government, but she had herself been a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs fellow who had worked at the Pentagon. And since I had come back and was interested in civil military relations and regional security cooperation, I wanted to better understand military planning, what went into it. And the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Affairs Fellow, which is an IAF fellowship, allows people in government to go into academia, academics to go into government, people in business to go in either. So everyone changes positions or seats for about a year to get this new experience. And so I asked to go to the Pentagon, and I worked with the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the J5 Policy and Planning Bureau, basically with the uniforms, and learned military planning through that process.
Okay. Um, can you tell us a little bit about, what you were learning there, and also, like what you had seen in Kenya? I'm fascinated by this idea of, seeing this kind of coup on the ground, and then learning how things work in America. Do you want to tell us about that?
Sure, a little bit. The military, I grew up on bases because my father was military, so I was quite comfortable in that environment. But that said, being in an office with 5 guys in the basement of the Pentagon was pretty intense. And what I learned really was how the interagency worked. They were very good at teaching me how to move policy through the different offices. And at the Pentagon, it's a very straightforward process. People are very clear about what their equities are. And when they basically approve a document that's going forward, say to the chairman, they look very narrowly at what their equities are, and then they'll allow the paper to go. It's very different at the State Department, where everybody wants to be an author of the policy. And so everyone, they don't know their equities. They spend quite a lot of time rewriting your approach to a policy. And so I had to learn those differences. But really, going into the interagency, they taught me about who's the belly button, who's the most important person in that office that you have to get their approval to move things forward or get their buy-in.
Yeah. And also, during this time, you did part of your fellowship with the African Affairs, is that right?
Yeah, so I did 9 months at the Pentagon, at the Joint Staff, and then I did 9 months at the NSC, in the African Affairs Office at the National Security Council, where I was a director looking at East Africa and Central Africa. And there I spent quite a lot of time coordinating policy and focused on Central Africa, especially the Great Lakes region. And so there was a great conflict there, and it intersects with HIV and AIDS because at that time, many of the peacekeepers were getting HIV and AIDS, right? And it was the trucking and the conflict zone, and there was a huge amount of AIDS people being infected by HIV and AIDS. And that was when Richard Holbrooke was the U.S. ambassador to the UN, and he tried to connect the two, the Great Lakes region and that conflict with the crisis of HIV and AIDS to bring greater attention to it. And so I had a chance to also engage then.
Yeah, and now I'm glad you mentioned Holbrooke because I remember him doing a lot of work to advance efforts against the HIV and AIDS crisis on the continent. So this was during the Clinton administration.
Yes.
How would you describe the state of American engagement with the continent and with the kind of global AIDS pandemic at the time?
Well, with the continent, I think that the second term of the Clinton administration, there was much more activity and much more engagement than during the first term. And this was under Secretary Albright, and this is when Susan Rice was the Assistant Secretary. And I recall that their attempt at that time was really to try to get more agencies within the U.S. government to focus on Africa. So they were going to the Energy Department and, different departments, not just state, the, Pentagon, DOD, and USTR, but other agencies as well, trying to get them involved on Africa. That was also a time when they did pass the AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. So that was really a big initiative of the Clinton administration. But at the time, I was working on conflict, and one of the biggest conflicts at that time was the Great Lakes, but it was also Ethiopia, Eritrea. And so that was part of my portfolio as East and Central Africa. So that was a huge amount of time and effort put on that. I didn't recall that there was a lot of attention to HIV and AIDS, except for especially what Holbrooke was doing at the UN, trying to tie it to peacekeeping operations.
I think President Clinton would later, I think, regret that he had not done more on global HIV and AIDS. Is that how you remember that?
Yeah, that's how I remember it. And I remember at the very end, this was now during the campaign of Gore, and ACT UP went to one of his events and acted up. And I recall that we were called down the hall saying, explain this HIV and AIDS, what's going on, what are we doing, how much are we doing, you know, it was like an emergency all of a sudden.
I want to ask a question about that, so maybe I'll ask that and go back. But Bush's campaign was not, because you had started to come to advise the Bush campaign. Yes. Was this on their agenda before the protests? Were they getting any sort of, you know, pressure?
Of President Bush?
Of
the Clinton, Gore?
The Bush campaign.
Oh, on the Bush campaign. Yeah. Well, yeah, I started. So Condi said, Bush is going to run. You need to get out of there. And so I left okay. NSC and I went back to Harvard, and then I joined the campaign. Okay. And so it wasn't really an issue, I would say, that the public was focused on in terms of the Bush campaign, but it was an issue that we were focused on. And so in his position paper on Africa, HIV and AIDS and health and education were a big part of the agenda. When Condi met with all the African ambassadors, it also came up there. And during the debate, I prepared his debate questions on Africa, which came up in the second debate, although I don't think they asked about AIDS, but it was on his briefing paper to talk about it. So it was a constant theme within the campaign on the Africa side. But I think that campaign was more focused on domestic policy than it was on international, and certainly not very much on Africa.
Okay, so talking about these years that bridges your Clinton years and the Bush campaign, how were you understanding the relationship between national security and public health crises like HIV and AIDS?
Well, I had a different take than the Clinton administration. I understood the Clinton administration tried to tie the two and say that HIV and AIDS, and especially in Africa, was a national security threat because they needed to get attention to the issue. And so it was a way to raise the profile. I didn't take that point of view. I think that HIV and AIDS was a problem of instability in Africa, and it was a threat to Africa's security because of how it was hollowing out the society. But I didn't think it was a threat to U.S. national security. And I felt that the attention to U.S. national security took away from what it essentially was, which was a health problem, and it needed to be addressed as a health problem. And so I didn't take that framing into the Bush administration. I basically said, we're not going to talk about it as a threat to U.S. national security. That's a very hard case to make, and it's a hard case to sustain. But you can make the case that it's devastating the continent. It's creating instability. It undermines our entire policy. We can't have a policy if you have such a death and destruction to society. And so that was the argument we made, and you have to approach it as a health problem.
Yeah. So I think it was around this time, right, that the NSC, it was Kenneth Bernard who was pushing for it to be recognized by the U.S. As a security threat, right? And the UN had already declared it one. And then in the midst of this, right, there's also the embassy bombings in East Africa and Kenya and Tanzania. Did the kind of threat of terrorism and extremism in Africa kind of shape these conversations for you and for them?
So the embassy bombings were in '98, right. So that was during the Clinton administration. I did not, and I don't think there was a single briefing paper that I wrote to the president that connected HIV and AIDS with terrorism. And I know that there's some people who would like to say that it's because we were in a global war on terrorism, we were trying to show the softer side with, you know, the health initiatives, PEPFAR, but that's not correct. And the evidence that it's not correct is that we started dealing with HIV and AIDS in a very prominent way long before 9/11, right? And terrorism really came on our agenda at 9/11, right? It wasn't the main threat. The main threat was, okay, China and Russia, these big powers. It wasn't a terrorism threat and, you know, non-state actor threat. But so I don't think that's true. I wasn't part of all of the conversations in the White House, but I can tell you at the NSC, in terms of the Africa portfolio, you will not find a single briefing paper to the president on HIV and AIDS that talks about terrorism.
Oh, that's great.
Just to clarify, you mean President Bush, right now?
President Bush, yes.
Yeah. Will you talk a little bit, you mentioned China and Russia.
Yes.
Will you talk a little bit about how that fits, or how those powers fit into the conversation we're having?
Well, on one side, in terms of strategy, the Bush administration, and during the campaign, he came in with a philosophy or strategy that said that you have to deal with the big powers, right? You have to deal with your Russias and your Chinas, the big threats to the United States. That carried over into our Africa policy. And so we said you also have to deal with the big powers in Africa that have leverage, not from a threat perspective, but from a leverage and support perspective. And so we emphasize Nigeria and South Africa as anchor countries in our Africa policy, where you could actually work with them in partnership and engagement and try to then get them to work in their sub-region more. And so we took the same philosophy. But on the HIV and AIDS side, I saw China and Russia as a big threat, and India, because when we were pushing for the initiatives, there were those in the administration who felt that we should be working on HIV and AIDS globally in places like China and Russia and India. And for me, that was just going to suck up all the resources. And from my perspective, they weren't the place that was the epicenter of the crisis. That was Africa. And so we needed to make sure that the programs were focused on Africa and not get, dissipated by going to a place as big as China or India.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned earlier that you went back to Harvard and onto the Bush campaign. Mm-hmm. Will you tell us about coming back into the NSC after the election?
Yeah, sure. I came back in and I was a special assistant to the president and senior director for African Affairs, which meant that I was the coordinator of the policy on Africa across the interagency. Now, the Bush administration did it a little differently because State Department tried to assert itself in that role. But having been a person at the Pentagon, I knew that the military and DOD were never going to allow State Department to control policy in that way. It had to be the White House. It had to be the NSC as the coordinating body. And so that was the role that I played at the NSC. I had a team of about 3 directors, each doing different regions, and I oversaw the entire portfolio.
Okay. I've heard you say elsewhere that when you came into this position, one of the things that you prioritized was bringing the HIV/AIDS portfolio into your bureau. Can you talk about that, or what your motivations were?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So I was with the guy Bob Joseph, who was our counterproliferation director, senior director. Him and I were on the transition team. And so we were the 2 people who went to the NSC and interviewed all of the staff who were still there, the directors who were still there, to ask them about what are the main issues on the agenda, what agreements had they signed recently, so that you have some continuity between the 2 administrations, or at least we knew what they had agreed to, so that whether we agreed or not, we at least were cognizant of it. And so as I was doing this, and of course I knew because I had been on the Clinton NSC staff as well, that the portfolio was held in multilateral affairs, sometimes in what they call international economic affairs, INTECON. And it was sort of split between there. And so what I did, because I was one of the first directors on the scene, was take the portfolio into Africa. And I did that because multilateral affairs was dealing with HIV and AIDS in terms of UNAIDS and the UN and the UN. And I'm like, but the epicenter is Africa. More than 70% of the people who are living with AIDS, who are infected with AIDS, are living in Africa. Teachers and nurses and, all of the middle class are dying. And, that productive age, from say 19, 20 to 50, they're dying from aid. So you have orphans and you have grandparents who are left in society. They can't run the society. And so because of that, I said, look, this has to be an Africa portfolio issue, and we should take the lead on this. And I didn't have any resistance because the director for multilateral affairs was a holdover from the Clinton administration because it was a short transition, as you remember. And I knew he was leaving. He was a friend, but I knew he was going to be leaving. And I was one of the first on scene as the director for the Bush administration. So I had the ability to take the portfolio. And of course, Condi was the national security advisor, and she was my advisor in terms of my PhD. And so I had a relationship with her of trust. And so she allowed me to take the portfolio.
Did you have thoughts at that time, right? Because this kind of approach from multilaterals versus what would become PEPFAR will become like a big part of planning for PEPFAR. Did you have, thoughts about the strengths or weaknesses of the multilaterals at that moment?
No, I didn't have any kind of ideology or political or policy orientation there. My orientation was we have to do more in Africa. And clearly what has been done isn't enough. And so it wasn't really to say that it should not be at the UN, but UNAIDS and the UN, they sit around and talk. That's what they do. They do a lot of talks and a lot of resolutions. But in terms of getting something done on the ground, that's a different story.
Okay, so you mentioned that this was part of the briefing while Bush is on the campaign, and then he's elected, and you're building up Africa as an important part. Where was HIV/AIDS on the new Bush administration's agenda? Where did it fit in with all of the other agenda items?
Well, it came up very early, and it came up very early because Secretary Powell wanted to have a presidential council on HIV and AIDS. And so he sent over a memo probably in the first week, could have even been in the first couple of days, asking about this presidential council. The White House, as I understood it, was against that. And the reason was they wanted to push everything to the agencies. They had a philosophy that the agencies were going to run policy, and the White House was not going to do that, right? And they said that the Clinton administration got this wrong. And so they didn't want to have any bodies like that, any kind of councils or, sitting in the White House. That should be pushed to the agency. So it became a debate, right? And there was a question about whether we're going to have this White House council, whether we're not going to have this White House council. It wasn't really about HIV and AIDS. It was about the structure of how we were going to run government, or how the Bush team was going to run the government. So it was a debate held at the White House. I wasn't privy to it other than hearing and supporting Powell's desire to have this HIV and AIDS Presidential Council, which was intended to elevate the issue on the agenda and in the attention of the administration. So I supported that. And I guess eventually it happened, but what came out of that was that Condi Rice was going to chair the National Security Council on HIV and AIDS. And so it was right from the very beginning on the agenda of the administration.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Condi Rice chaired?
I remember the first
goals.
Well, the intention was to develop what our policy would be on HIV and AIDS, and to bring the main agencies into that discussion. Because as chair, she oversaw the State Department, Treasury, USAID, whichever agencies for whatever issue were brought to the table. So HHNS, the Health and Human Services, would have been there for these types of meetings. The funniest thing, I can give you a story, is that the first meeting, I remember Rumsfeld was there, and Paul O'Neill, because he was Treasury Secretary, were there. And Rumsfeld kept looking at the briefing paper, sort of looking in the air, saying, what does this have to do with Cuba? And I thought, did he come to the wrong meeting? And I remember Paul O'Neill was insistent that the key was clean water, right? And that we needed to focus on clean water if we were going to address poverty and health in Africa. It's clean water, that's the key. So it was quite interesting meeting,
Yes.
but eventually things got far more on track.
Okay.
Yes.
And so, I mean, I guess all of these developments are part of making global AIDS a bigger part of the NSC's agenda. And as you mentioned, all this starts before 9/11, but does 9/11 change the nature of the conversation?
No,
Okay.
not so. I think that this was driven by the president's understanding. Where does that understanding come from is a question, right? I think it was driven by Secretary Powell. It was driven by Condi Rice. It was driven by key people who thought it was a critical issue. But the people who are left out of the story often are the African leaders. President Bush met with 15 African leaders in 2001, and on every single one of those conversations, HIV and AIDS came up. And so he was as much influenced in terms of his engagement with the leadership of the continent as anyone else, right? But they kept HIV and AIDS at the center as well of the agenda for Africa policy. And so every meeting he had, every briefing paper he got for those meetings, HIV and AIDS was right there in the center. And he had a natural curiosity about what could be done, right? He was especially focused on vaccination. Is a treatment, what are the treatment options? What can be done? And so from the very beginning, he was driven by that question of what could we do to address this problem.
What about I would say this is also the time there were several anthrax attacks on American officials, and so part of the Bush administration is thinking about building kind of domestic capacity to combat that. Were those concerns about bioterrorism or vaccination, shaping?
I don't know because I wasn't in those conversations. I do remember anthrax because we were quite worried about it. Anytime anyone got any powder in the mail or anything, and the mail went away all of a sudden, it wasn't delivered to our office. So I remember the significant attention to it, but it didn't come into the conversations on HIV and AIDS that we were having at the NSC on Africa. It might have been part of other conversations. Maybe there was, the bioterrorism office or the White House office made the connection, but it didn't come to my attention.
Also during this time, the Bush administration is grappling with the nature of foreign aid, right? And the kind of track record of American foreign aid. And so you are in the NSC thinking about the best ways to formulate policy on the continent. Can you tell us about your thoughts about the administration's approach to Africa when it came to policy making and foreign aid?
Sure, but should I answer your question before on terrorism?
Yes, please. Sorry.
That's whether 9/11 impacted. 9/11 did not stop us from pursuing the HIV and AIDS agenda. What 9/11 did was disrupt our process for some months, a few months, right? Where there was an extreme attention on continuity of government issues. Condi was very much focused on trying to build coalitions to deal with Afghanistan and Osama bin Laden. And so there was a time in which she wasn't chairing her senior director's meetings. Gary Edson was, right, who was part of the Intercon, and he was a deputy national security advisor. And so we had a disruption for maybe a couple of months or so, but we got right back on agenda, and she gave us instruction to continue to run our portfolios as we had been while she was focusing on America's security in the most acute fashion.
Okay, thank you for catching that.
Yes. Now on our approach to development assistance, I came in determined that we were going to increase our development assistance to Africa. It was less than $1 billion. I felt that was not right. We needed to do a lot more. I wasn't so much focused on exactly where that money should go, but that the money had to increase, right? And so there was a little bit of a tension within the administration of those who were saying there's too much focus on input and not enough focus on output. And that would be Gary Edson. And he was really leading that process. And he was our Sherpa for the G8. And so there was, because there was a lot of pressure that the United States should use 7% of its GDP, and it's underfunding development assistance compared to the Europeans. Of course, dollar for dollar, we're way more than they're doing, but in terms of the percentage, less. And I didn't see the validity of that argument. I just wanted it to be over $1 billion.
For 54/55
yeah, let's just get there, right?
Yeah.
So this, focus on input versus output became what was the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which was to say our money needs to be focused on results, not just how much it is, but what is it actually accomplishing. And the way to accomplish that is to work with, credible leaders in well-governed countries that, focus on health and education of their population, countries that focus on not having corruption, and countries that are basically well-governed. And so that became the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And we all worked on it. Treasury took a big part in it. NSC, both through Intercon and Multilateral Affairs, was working on it. AF, the Africa Bureau, was working on it. Again, my equities, as the military would say, is to make sure that most of the money goes to Africa, right? And I found that typically there was no money for Africa in the Congress until it was global, right? And so having a global initiative that was focused on Africa was the best way to get the most money possible to go into the region.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Millennium Challenge Corporation? How did it function? Who were the main players?
Well, it didn't function the way it was supposed to when it first started. Because the theory was that the World Bank had compacts with these governments, and those compacts were negotiated with the government, so it had the input of their agency. But in fact, and so the Millennium Challenge Corporation was, the Secretary of State and others were a committee or like a board, and then they would decide which countries qualified based on some criteria that we had put in place. The ones that I said, health and education, well-governed, not corrupt, et cetera. And so they would choose which countries would be there. And then the theory was we would have these compacts at the World Bank that then we could work with them on to fund. Well, those compacts were not real, right? I mean, some were good, many were not, some were non-existent. And so what the Millennium Challenge team found from the very beginning was that they had to go in and actually negotiate with these governments directly, which took longer than was expected. Because it was supposed to move very quickly because the compacts were there, we're just going to fund it. And that simply did not happen.
And this was also right after the launch of the Global Fund.
Yes.
Right? And President Bush had supported the launch of the Global Fund and agreed to make the U.S. a major contributor, but at the same time was exploring these other options. Why explore the other options when the Global Fund's getting off the ground?
Well, I think that the Millennium Challenge Corporation and the Global Fund and the HIV/AIDS are two separate things.
Okay.
So the HIV and AIDS, the Global Fund, he made that announcement in May of 2001 after a meeting with President Obasanjo of Nigeria and Secretary Kofi Annan. So they went out to the Rose Garden and announced the United States is going to put $200 million into the idea of a global fund. That was a very hard decision, and it was one that was very contentious within the White House because there were some people who felt that putting money into they were very suspicious. Remember when the Bush administration came in, it was very suspicious of the UN, right? And there were people in it that said, why are we going to give our money to some fund that the UN is now going to run and not do a very good job with it? So they did not like the idea of us, the U.S. government, putting our money in this fund.
So do you mind sharing? Who was this faction?
Well, there were people in the where I heard it from,
Okay.
is where I should say,
Okay. All right. Yeah.
is the Chief of Staff's office.
Okay.
I don't think it was Andy Card.
Okay.
But from within the Chief of Staff's office, I heard this. Now, that could be that they were reflecting what other views were within the White House as the Chief of Staff's office. I don't know, but that's where I heard it from.
Okay.
And so there was a big debate about whether, just like there was a debate about whether we're going to have this, presidential council, which became a task force. There was a debate about whether we should put any money into a global fund, and it was a real debate. Ultimately, what we did, and what people don't recognize, because they make this issue about you're not going to give money multilaterally, you're just going to give it bilaterally. It shows that you're not really an internationalist or whatever they called us at that time. But we designed the global fund. That's the thing that people don't realize. That happened in the Situation Room under Condi's leadership, with Gary very much chairing those meetings, right? We designed it. Bill Steiger from HH&S was there. He worked on this policy. We made sure that it met our criteria, which was public-private. We wanted to make sure that it respected intellectual property rights. We wanted to make sure that it was accountable to doctors and public health officials. Again, this is a health issue. There were certain criteria that we put in place, and Tommy Thompson was the first chairman of the board. And so people act like the United States was opposed to the Global Fund when it was Kofi Annan who brought the idea. It was the Africans who made a big issue of it during the Abuja, right before the president then announced it in the Rose Garden. But we were the drivers of the creation of it, and the first country to actually put money, make a pledge to put money into it. So it wasn't an either or. There were people who were opposed to it, didn't like the idea of putting money into some UN thing. But there were also people who said, no, we do need to leverage other people's money. And the best way to leverage and get other people to bring money, other governments, nonprofits, individuals, foundations, to put money into this is for us to show leadership. That was President Bush's decision, right? Which is why he then came out in May, very early. Think about it. We just got into office January 21st. And by May, he's making the announcement of $200 million to a global fund. This is very, very quick.
Yeah. I think it was around the same time that there was a bill introduced in Congress to commit funds. It was Frist and Kerry. Did you pay attention to that? Or?
No.
Oh, okay.
At the NSC, I didn't have a role. I was to stay away from Congress.
Yeah.
Stay very far away.
Yes. Yeah. I was just asking because Africa was central to that bill, and so
Yes.
I wasn't sure if.
But I was aware,
Okay.
and I was aware that there was an outreach to Congress, and there was also I should say a reach in or outreach to, I'm not sure which one it was, to domestic constituents. So this issue of global HIV and AIDS wasn't just about our Africa policy or our international policy. It also had very much a domestic component to it, and that had to be managed.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, I mean, the White House would get calls from people who very much opposed doing anything on HIV and AIDS, particularly in Africa. And some of those calls would come to my office. They would route them to my office. And, it was a lot of, ideas about promiscuity and, why are we spending our money on people who are just, out there, having a good time and being irresponsible. And those types of arguments were being made. So they were managing that, and as I said, the administration came in a little bit anti the UN, right? The UN needs to be reformed. There's all this money that we're spending. We're the biggest spender in the UN, and they're not doing the right things or doing it the right way. And so that debate was there as well.
Thanks. So as you said, that announcement in May 2001 is very quick, and already the Bush administration is moving to do more, right?
Yes.
So the next big development was the prevention of mother-to-child transmission program.
Yeah, the worst named initiative in the world.
But also, I'm always like, is it PMTC or is it? Yes.
So terrible.
Do you want to tell us about this?
Yeah, that's Gary Edson.
Okay, all right.
Well, so yes, the next big initiative is to prevent the infection of children during childbirth or breastfeeding from their mothers. And this initiative really, I think, comes from HHS, which is in NIH, which is getting far more involved. Just like we said that the Global Fund had to have accountability to public health officials and doctors, because this is a health issue. HHS takes on more of a role in terms of designing what the initiative is going to be, and also finding best practices. That was another criteria for the Global Fund. We have to work where there are best practices. And so HHS is out there and they're looking at where are best practices, and one of them is nevirapine, right? Nevirapine is an easy drug that a mother can take that will prevent that transmission in childbirth. Who can be against saving babies, right? I mean, it's like a fantastic initiative. And it's elegant because you have an intervention, which is the nevirapine. You have a drug that can stop this in 90% of the time. And so it was really quite like, let's grab onto this. This is going to be a lot of numbers to prevent HIV and AIDS, particularly to a next generation. And so that's where the initiative came. Now, it was very interesting. We were in the Roosevelt room when it was being debated and discussed. And this is another story. President Bush was there, of course. Andy Card was there. Condi Rice was there. And Tommy Thompson and Andrew Natsios, myself, and others, right? And they got into a huge fight in front of the president. It was amazing. Tommy Thompson and Andrew Natsios, because there was an argument about who's going to take the lead on this initiative. Is it going to be Health and Human Services or is it going to be USAID? And it was assumed that it was going to be Health and Human Services, but I have to give Andrew Natsios credit. He really stood up for USAID and pushed the issue. I was surprised. I mean, who does that in front of the president? But he did. And the compromise became where HHS has a bigger, or CDC, I'm sorry, where CDC has a bigger presence in a country, they will be the lead. And where USAID has a bigger presence in the country, they will be the lead. The other debate and discussion was around which countries. And we basically said the epicenter of this disease or pandemic is in Southern Africa and in East Africa. But we also looked at West Africa and brought in Nigeria and Cote d'Ivoire, which were big populations as well.
Can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with NIH during that early period, and particularly with Secretary Thompson and also with Dr. Fauci?
Yeah, I didn't have a major relationship with them. I normally would see them in the Oval Office when we were doing briefings to the president. And they were really the experts, right? When he was asking questions about, can we get a vaccine? What's adherence? If we get drugs, how are we gonna? They were the experts in that area. And so I just interacted with them basically in the Oval Office. But also with Bill Steiger and Joe O'Neill, some of the people who ran the Office of the National AIDS Policy, Scott Everts, we interacted in the Situation Room because there was an interagency meeting as well, and that's where we would interact. And they were also medical doctors and health professionals.
I'm curious about those meetings where the debates are happening. Is there any discussion about the costs of nevirapine? And how, because that would become a big part of the kind of later PEPFAR is, can you use generics? And, is that part of that early debate?
Where I remember that question not so much what the cost was in terms of the particular drugs, but I do recall that there was discussion with pharmaceuticals, right? And there was an uneasiness about the discussion. I think the Chief of Staff's office was running that because we had to be careful, right? Where government and the private sector are talking, there were some rules, I don't know what the rules were, but there's some rules that have to be adhered to when you're talking to the private sector. And I remember they were very conscious about that and tried to be very careful about how they were engaging. So that's one part of the cost. The second part of the cost was eventually there was debates about what's the scale of this initiative and where could funds be better used.
When did you, in this kind of process, when did you start to get a sense that this wasn't going to be enough for the Bush administration, that something bigger was coming, or that President Bush would ask for something bigger?
Well, it came up all the time.
Okay.
There were always discussions. I mean, there were discussions with very different people, but when I knew specifically about PEPFAR, if you're asking about PEPFAR, it was, I was invited to a policy time. The president would have these policy times where he would have a few officials in the Oval Office debating a policy. And in this policy time, Condi Rice was there, Mitch Daniels, who we called Blade, was there, Margaret Spelling was there, Gary Edson, Carol Thompson, Josh Bolton, myself, and I may be missing one or two people, but the debate was what scale of a new initiative are we going to do? And it was all about the money, right? It wasn't really so much about the design of the initiative, it was about the scale of the initiative. And it got very heated. That was a very heated meeting. And, I was pretty much there cheerleading, saying, yes, let's go big. But Condi was the one who was taking the blows, particularly from Mitch Daniels, who was OMB, who was saying, we can't do this and we don't have this kind of resources. And oh, by the way, the national security team has gotten all this money because of the global war on terror, which made Condi livid. Because she's like, did I start the global war on terror? This is not something that's a policy decision of ours. This is what we have to do to protect our nation. Margaret Spelling was talking about domestic policy and education and money needing to go, to domestic policy issues. And so it got pretty heated. The president had to calm it down a little bit. But that's when I knew that we were talking about something major on another level.
All right, so you mentioned those who are in the room there. Once the decision has been made that this amount of money is going to be a dream package, who are the major players that are starting the design of PEPFAR?
That's HHS.
That's it. Okay.
Yeah, HHS, NIH. That's happening over there.
How many people were aware that this was happening? Like, is it beyond that circle, or?
It was very close hold.
Okay.
It was very, very, very close hold and compartmentalized. And so it's not just the number of people, but it was also who knew which parts of it. Okay. So it was really, really tightly held.
Okay. Well, can you talk to us a little bit about what happens next, right? What becomes PEPFAR? What is PEPFAR? Introduce it for us.
Well, first of all, it was just exciting, right? The announcement was exciting. It was dramatic. It was unexpected for many people. Not me, I knew, but it was unexpected for many people. And so it was like, we're doing this, and we've got an answer. Remember, this is 2003. Again, I just keep emphasizing how fast these things are happening, right? Global Fund 2001, mother-to-child transmission 2002, PEPFAR 2003. So it's continuous, and we were working up to something, right? And this is the something, and so it was major. I have to say that really, this design is Randy Tobias. People don't like to use Randy Tobias's name, but I give him full credit because he had a strategy that he introduced to us that was ready, fire, aim, right? And he's like, this is an emergency. We've got to get this money out fast. We've got to save lives now. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go to the big nonprofits, you know, and we're going to put that money in there because they're already on the ground working, right? Then we can build back more local capacity in time. But what we have to do is get this out now. We've got to get these ARVs out to the people. Now we've got to do the prevention. Now we have to do the care now. And so it was ready, fire, aim. And I thought it was a brilliant strategy. It was very much in line with the Bush administration's Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is accountability, accountability, accountability. It has to be based on targets. We have to be able to know where the dollars are being spent, and we have to be able to show results. And so that was built into the initiative from the very beginning.
So you mentioned the nonprofits. Notably, faith-based organizations would be amongst those. Can you talk about any of the kind of challenges the Bush administration faced in including faith-based at this time?
Well, I don't think it was a challenge because they were on the ground working, right? I mean, that's just the reality. They weren't the only ones, but they were definitely on the ground working. Catholic Relief Services, for example, had a huge presence. And so it was natural that you would deal with it. Now, dealing with the faith-based community really came into, I think, highlighted in terms of the prevention side of the initiative, right? And I remember being at the Roosevelt Room with a number of faith-based groups. Jay Lefkowitz was the person who was really running that part of it. And also the evil genius, what's his name? you know who I'm talking about. Karl Rove. Karl Rove. Karl Rove was also very much handling parts of that, right, in terms of outreach. And the question was about abstinence, be faithful, use condoms. And the first time I heard ABC was in that meeting. And that came from Uganda, you know, and so again, that learning was happening. So basically the administration stood firm on that. It's going to be abstinence, it's going to be faithful, and it's going to be condoms. We're not going to get rid of condoms. It has to be this ABC approach, which has been proven effective in Uganda, which has lowered its, incidence rates, infection rates significantly over the years.
So did you follow, this is being kept very closely amongst a group of people who are designing it, and then it has to go through Congress. Did you follow, I know you just said that you are often kept separately,
yes.
But did you follow that process and what some of the debates were as it was moving through Congress?
Not really.
Okay.
I didn't follow it. I just knew they were working it hard.
Okay.
And it's to me, it's a differentiation between the Bush administration and follow-on administrations. Because follow-on administrations, and maybe they had a harder Congress, but they would always say, oh, Congress is blocking me on this. We worked Congress hard. The Bush administration was in there constantly talking to those senators and representatives. They were constantly having them over to the White House, talking to them on a bipartisan basis. And so it's not a matter of, oh, Congress doesn't want to do this. It's how much are you engaging with the Hill, right? I mean, the engagement was intense. Yeah, and so I think there's a difference there.
You mentioned ABC coming out of Uganda. I know that I read somewhere that the Musevenis count you as a close personal friend. Can you speak about the role they played? Because they had the ear of quite a few officials in D.C.
Yes. Yeah, no, President Museveni particularly was a standout leader on HIV and AIDS. And that's why President Bush at some point really started talking about the key is leadership. So even when we were looking at which countries would be part of PEPFAR, and also the mother-to-child transmission, it's like, are their presidents leading, right? And how are they leading? That wasn't universal, obviously, but it was important. It was an important signal. And President Museveni's leadership took the form of destigmatizing HIV and AIDS, right? He's one of the first presidents in Africa to do that, right? And to try to get people tested, and to, in fact, speak publicly. At every time he went out and spoke to his public, he talked about HIV and AIDS in every single speech. And so that type of leadership, I think President Bush admired from President Museveni.
So what you mentioned is, I think, a great place for us to transition to the next part of your career, because you're thinking about the power of these leaders when you become ambassador to South Africa, where their leadership was not always at the forefront of the HIV/AIDS crisis. So will you tell us a little bit about how you came to be ambassador and what made you want to take on this role?
So I'm sitting at a National Security Council meeting, or Principals Committee meeting. It was a National Security Council is when the president is in attendance. So Principals Committee, Condi's chairing, Secretary Rice is there and others. I don't remember what the meeting was about, but Secretary Rice starts going like this to me, like across the table. And he's like, and I'm like, well, what's that? And Condi's like, he wants you to call him. And so I called him and he said, do you want to be ambassador? I said, well, I don't know. I'm like, are you guys trying to get rid of me? Am I just really, am I beating you up too much here in terms of policy? But for whatever reason, he asked me if I wanted to be ambassador, and I said yes. And then I said I wanted to go to South Africa. Okay. And I wanted to go to South Africa because, again, it's an anchor country. Right, I understood the importance of South Africa to the continent as a whole. And President Mbeki was actually very much part of the leadership of that continent, right? President Obasanjo, President Mbeki, President Wade, these guys were what they called the new Partnership for Africa's Development. So they were playing more of a setting of the agenda for the continent role through the African Union in other ways.
And I mean, this was a very exciting time to travel to South Africa, right? The country is less than 10 years old. Can you tell us about the situation on the ground when you arrived in terms of the funding and infrastructure to tackle HIV and AIDS?
Well, it was problematic particularly from a leadership point of view. I think that the population was doing its best and civil society was doing its best. But the leadership wasn't leading on HIV and AIDS. Their messaging was, basically, I think President Mbeki was slightly embarrassed by the whole thing, right? I think that, the stigma of it and it being sexually transmitted was more than he could take. But he wanted to emphasize poverty as the real issue in South Africa, not HIV and AIDS. And he downplayed it and said that it wasn't as prevalent as people were saying it was. And then his Minister of Health, Shabalala, wanted to say, and it's correct, nutrition is key, but she wanted to say it was all about nutrition, right? And I don't know whether that was because they felt that the government couldn't respond, or it was some bizarre theories that they had read, or what the case was, but that leadership was very problematic. And I took it upon myself as ambassador to address it all the time. When I was in the press, I would talk about HIV and AIDS. I had the events. I went to meetings and events. And I engaged with President Mbeki and with Minister Shabalala. I had frank conversations with them. I invited her to events, and I tried to have a dialogue and engage. I think President Mbeki at some point had become a lightning rod, and he wasn't allowed to change his message. Even if he intellectually, and I don't know if he did, but even if he intellectually had changed it, every time he said anything, people attacked him. And so it's because at some point I kept saying to him, you have to speak about this, you have to lead, you have to talk about it. But then when he would, he'd get attacked. And so I was like, well, maybe it's better that you don't say anything and allow us to work, which is what they did. And so for whatever, the rhetoric was, the fact of the matter is they didn't stop any programs on the ground. We were allowed to work easily in South Africa.
What about, did you have any relationships with, because the treatment action campaign would become, you know, a kind of major pressure point for Mbeki and subsequent governments. Was there any kind of U.S. liaisons with the activists?
Oh yeah. I wasn't personally engaged with them so much, but my team was. The CDC was really the lead for us on PEPFAR, and the way it works is the ambassador is the head of the country team, and so I'm responsible for the coordination of the embassy as a whole. But CDC was really the lead, and I had absolute faith in the doctor who was leading it, a guy named OK. His last name is long,
Okay.
but his first name is OK. And I had absolute faith in him because he was, you know, a long-time practitioner. He'd been country director for CDC in Nigeria and other different places, and so he was a true professional and had all those that network and relationships.
So you've just mentioned a little bit about your responsibilities as ambassador. Where did PEPFAR fit within, right? Because there's still a GOA to there are all these things.
It was a major part of the portfolio, major. And so I had a responsibility, as I said, to always speak about the issue. I visited with different organizations, Mother to Mother organization and others. Right, I went to hospitals. I went, you know, I made myself known as a big advocate here, and talked about stigma and, you know, getting rid of stigma. I went to orphanages, and so it was a huge part of what we did on a daily basis.
I mean, how did that feel, right? I'd say like the year that you're in South Africa is a year of incredible like emergency scale up, where people, you know, people talk about the Lazarus effect, right? Like,
Yes.
How did it feel?
It felt good. It felt very good to be doing something, right?
Yeah.
And for America to be leading, it felt very, very good. Yeah, I was very grateful, and I felt like the work that we had done in Washington, and you know, because you know, you're in battles, right? You're fighting for things, right? You're fighting for Africa to be the focus of PEPFAR. That's not you know, you're fighting with the China guys, and you're fighting with even the Western Hemisphere, right? We got Haiti in there and Guyana. Haiti there because of best practices on delivering medicine to rural areas through motorcycles. That came from Haiti, right? And so we, you know, but I wanted Africa to be the core, so you had to fight for that, right? I wanted HIV and AIDS to be high and prominent on the agenda. You had to fight for that. And so having fought those battles, to now be in a position to be an implementer on the ground was absolutely a blessing.
Yeah, that's wonderful. You had mentioned earlier some of the tussles between state and USAID and CDC and where they would fit in these initiatives. Did you have any experience of that in South Africa, or the CDC was pretty firmly the lead already?
The CDC was the lead on HIV and AIDS.
Okay, so you were called back to the U.S. rather quickly.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us about the transition back, how you came to this new role, for what were you responsible?
So when Condi became Secretary of State during the second term, I had just gone out to South Africa because I got there in August and the election was in November. And so when she came in as Secretary of State, she told me, I'm going to give you a year.
Enjoy it. Go to Durban, to the beach, eat in Cape Town.
Yeah, so that's, and you know, if you look at who she brought in as her assistant secretaries, some of us were her senior directors at the NSC. You know, so Dan Freed for Europe went over, Tom Shannon from Western Hemisphere went over to become assistant secretary, and I went over from Africa as well. So she had a team that she was comfortable with and she wanted to keep with her.
So where did PEPFAR sit in your priorities?
Well, now PEPFAR is not the top of my agenda as Assistant Secretary. Assistant Secretary, I'm the top point person on Africa for the U.S. government in terms of foreign policy. And so I'm dealing with a lot of issues of conflict issues and other issues. And so PEPFAR is running on its own through OGAC. I keep an eye on it. And when I'm traveling in Africa as Assistant Secretary, I still go to, to HIV and AIDS clinics and show the flag as such. And sometimes I would go out with Randy Tobias if he was in the same country, or, I don't think we ever traveled together, but sometimes we were in the same country and would do events together as well.
Did this come up as like a kind of policy issue? Because during your term, there would have been the first reauthorization of PEPFAR.
Yeah.
Did you have any kind of advising roles on what needed to change in the policy or not?
No.
No, okay. Were you privy to any of like the Bush administration's concerns about reauthorization?
No.
Okay, all right.
You're talking about the 2008?
Yeah.
Reauthorization. No, it was like big, right? It was like, I think we were asking for 30 billion.
Yeah.
Right, and I remember it was big.
And I think there were a lot of kind of debates about expanding it to different countries, and still debates about the ABC and.
I wasn't part of that.
All right. What about as the Obama transition team came in? Did you have any advice for them on where PEPFAR would sit in the priorities for Africa?
No, I was pretty confident that they were supportive, and because we were writing Senator Obama's talking points when he went to Africa, it was really quite interesting and ironic that he's criticizing President Bush, right? Making his case. He's running against McCain, but he's criticizing Bush the whole time. But yet, when he's going to Africa, he's asking our bureau to, write his talking points for him, which in some ways bothered me, but in other ways was smart, because then it carried on our policy, right? We're like, okay, we'll do this. So I didn't see that there was going to be any major departure from the focus on HIV and AIDS. And also Susan Rice was his national security advisor during the campaign, and I knew that she cared quite a lot about international HIV and AIDS in Africa and globally as well.
Okay, so if it's okay with you, if there's nothing I'm missing from your time with African affairs, ask some like reflection questions about PEPFAR.
Sure.
So we talked a little bit earlier that PEPFAR was designed with accountability in mind, and there was a tremendous amount of training and labor that went into data collection and analysis. In your experience as you watched this, has that succeeded?
Well, I'm not an expert here, but I think that it did, insofar as we know what the numbers are. But I do believe, I've heard that OGAC, the head of OGAC, over time became too focused on the numbers, and that it became problematic. But I don't know that directly. I just know that as a hearsay thing from people who I respect.
And then the design of PEPFAR enabled, an array of bodies to become partners in testing, treatment, and prevention. How did you see this, the kind of debates around ABC and faith-based? Did that kind of hinder the long-term health of PEPFAR? Did it challenge it in some of the reauthorizations?
I think that. No, I think that ABC was exactly the right approach. It had proven effective, and it's proven effective in PEPFAR. I believe that those are political debates of constituents who want to fight each other, right? It has nothing to do with actually saving lives on the ground. And I think that you need all of those approaches. And I know that there's some people are like, oh, there weren't enough condoms. I never saw a shortage of condoms, right? When I was in South Africa, there were no shortage of condoms. They were handed out everywhere. Yes. So I don't see that. I just think it's ideological. And, you know, the prevention side was like 20% of the funding. Maybe you could have put more funding in the prevention side. Maybe that's an issue. But what was the emergency was getting ARVs. So for 55% to be in ARVs is exactly where it needed to be. Right now, the 20% that was for prevention, a third, A, a third, B, a third, C, a third. Right? I don't understand what they're arguing about, really. So I think it's more politics than anything else.
Also, part of these more kind of contentious debates often were the attention to kind of gender and sexuality, right? But some of the kind of amendments that were being debated in Congress were around prostitution and women's access to a full range of reproductive health.
Yes.
How did you see all of that impacting PEPFAR's?
It did. I think it did. I think it did impact PEPFAR insofar as there was the perception. I don't know if the reality, but there was a perception that you could not fund clinics that were providing abortion. Now, my understanding was that you could. Just the money that was being used for HIV and AIDS could not be used for abortion, but you could fund clinics. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I never came across that issue when I was in South Africa. I do think that you have to have outreach to prostitutes. I think they're part of the public just like anybody else is. And they're citizens, right, of those countries. They're key constituents, and they deserve their lives as well. And so I don't understand not being able to outreach to every community that's impacted. And so I don't agree with, you know, this notion of, you know, you can't, and I don't know that PEPFAR stopped anybody from doing so either, but, you know, the idea, the argument, I think is not valid when you're trying to save lives.
What about, one of the goals of PEPFAR was to encourage increased local ownership of the programs. 20 plus years in, how is that succeeding?
Well, I think it's gone well. I mean, building the health infrastructure from the very beginning of the Bush administration, during the campaign, we talked about that. You've got to build the health infrastructure. And so, you know, there's also the argument, oh, you just did a single disease and you didn't build the health infrastructure. Not true. You know, doctors, community health workers, laboratories, all of that was being built out through PEPFAR funding. If you take mother to mother, the mother to mother program, it was about, I don't know, 50 or 60 clinics in Cape Town. It's over 500 now in 7 countries because of PEPFAR, right? And that's mother to mother, meaning that these mothers are the mentors of other mothers, teaching them how not to transmit the infection to their children. I mean, how local can you get? Right. How grassroots and community-based can you get? And that is spread to other different countries. It was just in one province in South Africa before PEPFAR. So I think PEPFAR has been very effective.
What do you, and this may be a question that you're less comfortable with answering right now, but you know, PEPFAR's future is more in question than ever. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about if it is not continuously supported, what that might mean for Africa's relationship with the U.S., particularly vis-a-vis China and Russia.
Well, PEPFAR, you know, I love PEPFAR, right? But I also sometimes are like, ugh, because people tend to say, oh, Africa policy, PEPFAR, right? And they reduced the entire policy to PEPFAR when the policy was more holistic and effective, right, in terms of ending wars and all types of other stuff. But what PEPFAR did was take it to another level of appreciation. And I say that from the point of view is because your last question about to what degree did PEPFAR get into sustainable, community-based, local institution building and support, right? It touched the people. And so the people knew that they were being kept alive because of the U.S. government and the people of the United States. And so it penetrated a level to society that hardly ever happens. And so now snatching that life-saving, that life-saving drugs or, support or help to orphans, snatching that away, what would that say to those populations? That troubles me significantly. China, on the other hand, is absolutely in those communities now through radio, through social media, through the distribution of not satellites, but what I'm trying to say.
Like internet?
No, energy. Energy, solar. Solar panels. Their solar panels are everywhere. So they're into local communities. And are we going to pull out at the same time? I don't think that serves our interests at all.
Yeah. Okay. As we kind of start to wrap up with some concluding questions, can you tell us, based upon your experience and watching this for 20 years, how would you describe PEPFAR? What would you highlight as the program's biggest achievements?
Well, I think PEPFAR, Bono said it once, and I'll refer to Bono. I remember he was in a meeting with Condi in her office in the West Wing, and he said, it's got to be big, and it's got to be like a stage production. And if you've ever seen Bono perform, it's like big, right? Mm-hmm. That's what PEPFAR was. It's big, right? It's transformative. It shows real leadership. And at the same time, it was effective, right? It was designed well and monitored well so that it's very effective. And so it's been life transforming for millions and millions of people. And so I don't think you can get anything better than that, right? Where you can actually show it. You did it. And we've continued to do it. And, president after president after president has stayed with it. The Congress is bipartisan, right? So I think it shows the best of America.
When you reflect back on this time and kind of working on all the things that shape PEPFAR's success on the continent, about what are you most proud of, and where are the areas that you wish that perhaps more had been done?
I am most proud of all of it. I'm proud. I think success builds on success. We did the Global Fund. That was the big fight. That was the hardest fight, right? To get over that hump. Then we got mother-to-child transmission. That was, just heartwarming, saving babies, right? And then we did PEPFAR, which was actually the big deal, right? And then we did malaria. Then we did, tropical diseases, and just went on and on and on. And so I'm very proud of that. Where I think we may have gone too far is it seemed to have crowded out some aid in other ways to other sectors. When I would go out to talk to ambassadors, you get the sense that 90% of their foreign assistance budget was health, right? And I'm like, but what about education? And what about trying to support entrepreneurship and some of the other areas. I think our success may have just taken us too far and not diversified sufficiently. I don't have evidence of that, but I sense that may be the case, that we've just gone so far into the health side that we're missing other things.
Has PEPFAR influenced how you think about public health and foreign aid?
Yeah, accountability.
Yeah.
I used to be an input person, right? When I started, I told you I just wanted $1 billion in foreign assistance, wherever it was going to go, but I just had to be $1 billion. And I am more of an output person. What is the money being used for? How effective is it? Let's do targets. So it transformed my mindset about, but of course, because we had the money. If you don't have the money, you can't set targets. Yeah. So getting the money was important, but also what happens with it, and how accountable are we for it, and those recipients, how accountable are they for using it appropriately is very important.
Okay, is there anything that you feel that I've missed?
No. I just think the missing actor in the story are African leaders. Yeah. And that, like President Mohai talked to President Bush a lot about treatment, right? And he put all citizens of Botswana who needed treatment on treatment. Mm. And President Bush really admired that type of leadership. And so those discussions, President Bush met with so many African leaders, and that engagement and those discussions were formative in what we did. And I think that administrations after that never engaged at the same level that President Bush did with African leaders, right? And I think that that's where the appreciation is when you look at when he went to Tanzania and met with President Kikwete, and just how he was. It's not just that he was appreciated because he put a lot of funding. He was appreciated because he listened, and he engaged, and it was, peer-to-peer types of discussions and respect. And so I think that ingredient in our foreign policy, in terms of effectiveness of initiatives and policy, is often missed. You cannot make it up, sitting in Washington. You've got to engage with the people who you're trying to support or influence.
Yeah. No, I think that's an excellent point. A really great point to end on. So
Yes.
I'm gonna say I really appreciate you giving your time. Daniel, do you have anything else to?
I don't.
Oh,
Fantastic.
yeah, it's been really wonderful.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
So